Hello friends, let's try to understand useEffect and how it works and talk about the most common useEffect problems. You might think that you know how to use useEffect, but it's really important to understand the main concept of this hook. When does it run? How do dependencies work? What's the difference between primitive and non-primitive dependencies? When we should use a cleanup function? I'm gonna cover all those questions, so don't skip this video. It's gonna be really helpful for you to understand the basics, and you will feel more confident when you use useEffect in your next project. Okay, as you can see, we have a number state. In the beginning, this number is 0. And we have a button that increases this number using a click event, and we show this number in this span. I will write here console log, so whenever we update our state, our component will be re-rendered. Like that. Actually, let's write here how many times it renders. Okay. As you realize, at the beginning it renders this component twice. But don't worry about that. It's just because of React strict mode in the index file. If I disable it, as you can see, it works as we expected. We are gonna talk about this strict mode and why it's happening soon. But before, I will create a useEffect. I will say again console count, so we will be able to see when and how many times it runs. And let's write here any effect. It can be an API request, DOM manipulation, or whatever we want to run after rendering the component. So let's change the title of the page, for example. I'm gonna write exactly the same thing. So when I click on this button, as you can see, it updates the title. And as you realize, there is a really short delay between this number on the page and this number on the title. That's because useEffect runs after rendering the component. It returns all these elements here and only after that runs this effect. Let me demonstrate what actually happens here. Essentially, we have three main elements: our component, React itself, and the browser. And in the first render, the number is 0. The component says, "Hey React, you should render this HTML result." And after rendering, don't forget to run this effect. And React says, "Hey browser, we have some changes to update DOM." And finally, browser takes those changes and shows them on the screen. And after this rendering process, React finally runs the effect that we give, and the browser takes those changes and shows them on the screen again. But there is a problem here because this useEffect runs on every render. If I create a name state here and update that name using this input, whenever I write something inside this input, my component will be re-rendered. And as you can see, the useEffect runs also, but it's not supposed to run because it depends on only this number. This is where we should use useEffect dependencies. After this function, I will write an array and inside its dependencies. In this case, it's gonna be this number. And it means run this function at the beginning and after run it again when only this value changes. And right now, as you can see, it runs at the beginning. It's not gonna run again even if I re-render the component unless I change this number. And sometimes we don't need any dependency and we want to run this effect only once. Let's say title of the app, and we don't need this anymore. I will delete and it will be an empty array. In this case, it will run only after the initial render, like this. But there is something you need to be really careful about, and it's the type of the dependency. Let me explain. As you can see, we have two states, and there's an input which updates this name state, and we show this user state here. Name is an empty string, and selected is false. Let's create two buttons. First one will be updating the username, and the second one will be updating the selected boolean. Let's create functions quickly, and update object properties. If you don't know why we are updating them like that, I highly recommend you to watch the previous video. Okay. As you can see, it works properly. Right now, I want to create a useEffect. And whenever we change this state, it's gonna write the state has changed, so useEffect runs. Let's try. It's the initial render. I will update this name. As you can see, it works again because the state has changed. I will click here and select it is true right now, and useEffect runs again. Everything works perfectly. If I click again, it's still true, but as you realize, useEffect runs again. But why is that happening? Let's click here. The name is still John, and the selected is still true. Nothing has changed. My dependency is still the same. Well, it's a really common problem, and it's hard to understand for beginners because they are struggling to understand the difference between primitive and non-primitive data types. But don't worry, I'm gonna explain everything. Let's say there is a variable which is a string, John, and another one, it's John also, and let's make some comparisons. I will say A equals B, and it's true, they both are John, A equals John, and of course, they are the same. Basically, John equals John. Let's do the same thing for numbers. C equals 1, D equals 1, and if I compare them, it's gonna be true. Is D equal to 1? Of course. And finally, booleans. True equals true, false equals false. It's exactly the same thing. So those three data types are primitives. Strings, numbers, and booleans are primitive. What about objects? Let's create quickly two objects which are exactly the same, and if I compare them, as you can see, it's false. It's happening because even if they look the same, they refer to different points in the memory. So they are two different objects with the same content. You can think like two shopping carts. They look the same, they have the same products inside, but their locations are different, so we can understand that they are two different carts. And if I refer to exactly the same point, these two objects will be the same. I'm not creating a new one, I'm just referring to the same location. Of course, I'm not gonna explain stacks, heaps, or that kind of data structure terms, but you should know that computers compare values of variables when they hold a string, number, boolean, null, or undefined, but when it comes to objects or arrays, they compare their references instead of their content. So we can compare arrays in the same way and just work like an object. But do not misunderstand here. In React, yes, we are using dependency arrays, but React doesn't compare two different arrays like that. It compares every single element in this array. Okay, if we give here variables with primitive values, it's not a problem, but if it's an object or array, we have to be careful. So how we can solve this issue? Actually, there are different options. If you want to, you can create here a use memo hook and memorize what you need in this state. In this case, we are gonna need a name and selected, and this user will be changed only if the name or selected changes. So even if we have more properties here, it's gonna depend on only these two. Let's change this dependency. Okay. The name has changed, but after that it's not gonna work again and again, because the name is still the same. Let's make this true, and after it will not run again. What else you can do? Basically, instead of use memo, you can write here every single primitive variables like that. It depends on your use case. Another mistake is to incorrectly update the state in useEffect. Let's say we have a number state again. I'm gonna write it here. What I want to do is to increase this number every 1 second. To do that, I will use setInterval. Every 1 second, it will update the state like that. If you look here, you will see that something is wrong. There is a weird glitch here. If I write here console log, and as you can see, there is an infinite loop. It's happening because every second the number is changing. And since the number is our dependency, it runs this function again and again. To solve this problem, instead of updating states using the state variable itself, you should use an updating function. I've already explained this function in the previous video, and now it runs only once and it works almost perfectly. I say almost because it takes us to another common problem. useEffect cleanup functions. Let's add here any text and save the file. As you realize, it just broke the counter here. Whenever I add something else, it gets worse. That's because in every render, we actually create another interval without cleaning the previous one. As you can see, we have many intervals running. Of course, to find out this issue, we shouldn't test it by writing here something, and this is where React strict mode is so important. But we are gonna talk about it at the end of the video. We can test it like that for now. To fix this problem, we should use a cleanup function. Let me explain how it works. It's pretty easy. Let's say we have a toggle state and a button. When we click on this button, it updates the toggle. If it's false, it makes it true. If it's true, it makes it false again. So basically, it will re-render the component on every click and it's gonna trigger this use effect. Like that. In the first render, this effect is gonna run anyway. But for the next renders, we can return a cleanup function that runs before the actual effect in order to cancel what we did in the previous use effect. You are gonna understand better right now what I mean. Let's demonstrate with console logs. In the initial render, it will say useEffect runs, and we can make something using toggle or whatever. And when I click on this button, before running this effect again, it's gonna run this cleanup function. So we can clean the previous interval or event listener or whatever we do inside this effect. I will say wait. And after cleaning, okay, done, you can run the effect. Okay, let's try. It's the first render, and when I click, it runs the cleanup function first, and only after that it runs the effect again. And it's extremely useful. It prevents any memory leaking and makes your applications much faster. I will give some use cases and you will understand better. Let's get back to the previous example. As I said, we should clean this interval. I will create a cleanup function and inside clear interval function. Of course, we should pass this interval in order to clean it. To do that, I will say const interval and I'm gonna pass it here. And let's write something, cleaning time. Okay, as you can see, after every render, it cleans the interval, so it doesn't occupy any place in the memory each time. And another and most common case is fetching data from an API. Let's say we have two pages and this page includes just the link, and when we click on this link, it shows the posts page. And here, we are fetching data using useEffect. There is a fake API and it includes 100 posts. After fetching those posts, it updates this state. And finally, we are showing the title of each post here. As you can see, everything looks okay, but actually there are some possible problems. Right now, I'll go ahead and turn on the slow mode so we can observe clearly. And let's write here the posts. Okay, I'm clicking, and before fetching data, I want to turn back. And as you can see, even if I'm in the another component, it still fetches all these data and updates the state. But it should be cancelled immediately as soon as we leave the component. This is why we need a cleanup function here. It's a basic example, but for more complex cases with more states, you will have bigger problems. You should come here and create a cleanup. and I will show you a really common strategy. Firstly, I'll create here a variable and it's gonna be true when we fire this function. Basically, we are gonna subscribe to this API request, and as long as it's true, we are gonna set this state. But when we want to cancel, it's gonna be false. This naming is not important. You can say anything, like it's cancelled. It's easier to understand, I think. At the beginning, it's gonna be false, and in the cleanup function, it's gonna be cancelled true. In this case, we will update only if it's false. Let's try. Right now, everything works perfectly. It doesn't update the state. Let me give you one more example. We have a user component and it fetches a single user using the ID in the URL. If it's user 1, it fetches the first user. If it's 2, it fetches the second user, so on. Finally, we have the user information here and 3 links in order to go to different user profiles. Basically, when we click them, the ID will be changed, and when the ID changes, useEffect will fire this function and update the user. So if I don't use a cleanup function, let's see what's gonna happen. I will turn the slow mode on again. Now I will click on user 2 and user 3 right after that. And as you can see, even if the URL is user 3, it shows the second user first. That's because it's not cancelling the request and updating the state in any case. User 1, user 2, user 3. It shows us all of them and it's pretty annoying. Let's do the same thing. This time I will use another common naming. Unsubscribed, false. If we cancel, it's gonna be true. And I will write cancelled. And if we still subscribed, which means unsubscribed is false, we will update the user. You can do the same thing for catch block also. Let's see. Okay, perfect. It shows only one user. By the way, it's not the only way to cancel requests. For beginners, it's totally okay. But if you want to go ahead and create a more professional cleanup function, you can use JavaScript abort controller. It allows us to intercept an API request so we can cancel it at any time. We are gonna use its signal method and pass it in the fetch method as an option. Basically, when we want to cancel the request, we are gonna send here a signal and the fetch method will be destroyed immediately. Of course, we are gonna send this signal in the cleanup function, controller, and abort. Let's try. As you can see, it throws an error. The user aborted the request. Perfect. Let's go one step further and write here a catch method to handle this error. I will write here a condition. If the error name is abort error, which identifies this error, I will say request cancelled. If it's something else, you can write it directly or create an error state and update it here, whatever you want. I will say to do handle error. Let's try. I'm clicking and perfect. It's much better right now. And if you are using Axios instead of JavaScript fetch, there is something similar. Let's change it to Axios first. It will be a get method. I will delete this option. We are gonna write something else. We don't need a JSON object. And it's gonna return a response and we will use response.data. And I will delete here and here. Okay, it's really similar. We are gonna use Axios cancel token and source. Whenever we want to cancel the request, we are gonna use the cancel method and I will pass here the cancel token like that. And finally, Axios is gonna check whether the error comes from the cancellation or not. If it does, it will write here request cancelled. By the way, those codes will be in the description below. You can check whenever you need them. Okay, let's try. And perfect. Okay. Before ending, let's talk about React strict mode. I will write here useEffect mounts and unmounts or useEffect runs, cleanup runs, whatever you want. And as you can see, it runs only once. But if I take this strict mode back, as you can see, this strange behavior occurs. It just acts like the component renders twice, but actually it doesn't. After React 18, it became one of the most controversial parts of the library. Some developers got crazy. They thought the new version of React was broken and they tried to find out some strange solutions. But the answers to all questions are already on the official website. Firstly, there is nothing to worry about. It happens only in development mode. So when you deploy your apps, it's gonna work as you expected. Secondly, it's not a bug, it just makes you sure that there is no problem before the production. There are some titles here that strict mode helps, but since this is a useEffect tutorial, I will explain how it affects useEffect lifecycles. For better understanding, I'm gonna open up the previous example. I will comment this out again, and if you remember, even if we don't use a cleanup function, it just works fine. And there is no way to understand if something is wrong or not. We just found out the problem by adding here some additional elements. Let's take this strict mode back. And right now, as you can see, it increases this number 2 by 2. And I understand that something is wrong. I couldn't complete the lifecycle properly. And if I use the correct version and clear the previous interval, strict mode tests this for me, and it works perfectly. Basically, this mode is really important to find out bugs, especially in useEffect, and I recommend you not to remove it or try to find out some weird solutions. Just leave it like that, believe me, it's gonna help you. Okay, I think it's enough for today. If you learned something new today, please like the video and let me know which hook do you want to see in the next tutorial. Don't forget to follow Lama Dev's social media accounts. I hope I'll see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.